Good afternoon to our listeners on Parliament Radio 105.5 FM, our viewers on the Parliament channel, and those of you joining us via the World Wide Web on the Parliament's website www.ttparliament.org or via our YouTube channel ParlView. We welcome you to our coverage of today's sitting of the Senate. It is Thursday, May 25th, 2017. As indicated in House Notes, one paper will be laid. There are some 3 questions that qualify for oral answer. And debate is expected to commence on the Fire Service Amendment Bill 2017. This bill was already passed in the House of Representatives on April 21st. We take you over now to the chamber for the start of today's proceedings.
The Honorable the President.
We welcome you to the 23rd sitting of the Senate in the second session of the 11th Parliament that takes place on Tuesday, May 25th, 2017.
Let us pray. Almighty God, we willingly acknowledge you as the supreme being, most gracious and most merciful. Look down, we beseech you, on us who are members of this Senate, and deign to assist us in the duties that we have to perform on behalf of our beloved country of Trinidad and Tobago. Open our eyes to see the truth and help us to accept it with all its implications into our lives. Direct us, O Lord, in our deliberations, so that setting aside private interests, unwholesome prejudices, and personal affections, we may treat all matters set before us with honesty, courage, and conviction. Through all we say and do in this Senate, may we give glory and honor to your holy name, inspire confidence in our fellow citizens, and make a positive contribution to the peace and prosperity of our nation. Amen.
Announcements by the President.
Honourable Senators, I have granted leave of absence to Senator H.R. Ian Roach, who is ill, and to Senator David Small, who is out of the country. Honourable Senators, I have received the following correspondence from His Excellency the President, Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, ORTT-SC. The Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, by His Excellency Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, ORTT-SC, President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. To Pastor Clive Dottin. Whereas Senator Hugh Russell Ian Roach is incapable of performing his duties as a senator by reason of his illness. Now, therefore, I, Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, President as aforesaid, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(b) and Section 44(4)(c) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, Pastor Clive Dottin, to be temporarily a member of the Senate with effect from the 25th of May 2017 and continuing during the absence of Senator Hugh Russell Ian Roach by reason of his illness. Given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the Office of the President, St. Anne's, this 25th day of May, 2017. To Mr. Albert William Benedict Sidney. Whereas Senator David Small is incapable of performing his duties as a senator by reason of his absence from Trinidad and Tobago. Now, therefore, I, Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, President as aforesaid, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(a) and Section 44(4)(c) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, Albert William Benedict Sidney, to be temporarily a member of the Senate with effect from the 25th of May 2017 and continuing during the absence from Trinidad and Tobago of the said Senator David Small. Given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the Office of the President, St. Anne's, this 25th day of May, 2017. Honourable Senators, senators are required to take the oath.
I, Clive Dottin, having been appointed a member of Parliament, do swear by Almighty God that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I am about to enter.
I, Albert William Benedict Sidney, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do swear by Almighty God that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I am about to enter.
Bills brought from the House of Representatives, petitions, papers.
Leader of Government Business.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following paper as listed on the order paper in the name of the Minister of Finance. The annual audited financial statements of the Trinidad Nitrogen Company Limited for the financial year ended 31st of December 2016.
Reports from committees, urgent questions on notice.
Senator Ma. Oh, sorry.
No,
Leader of Government
Yeah.
Business.
Madam President, the government is pleased to announce that it will be answering all questions on the order paper.
Senator Ma.
Yes, thank you. Question number 79 to the Honorable Minister of Energy and Energy Industries.
Minister of Energy and Energy Industries.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, the Trinidad and Tobago energy sector is at a crossroad. Sustained declining production combined with low global commodity prices have diminished the contribution of the sector to national economic development. Its contribution in 2011 to the national GDP was 45% and to revenue at 41%, declined in 2016 to 18% and 18.1% respectively, based on provisional data. Given this new economic environment, the government recognizes that it must chart a new strategic direction for the energy sector. This is critical for the efficient management of our country's existing energy assets and hydrocarbon resources. Paramount to this exercise is the capability of the government agency charged with the responsibility for the monitoring and regulation and regulating of the energy and mineral sectors in Trinidad and Tobago. The Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries has been given that responsibility. However, the ministry has been weakened by the loss to industry on a sustained basis of key technical personnel and by retirement of senior managerial personnel. The recent attainment of the retirement age of 60 years by the Permanent Secretary, Mr. Selwyn Lashley, is a case in point. Mr. Lashley, who has been at the helm of the ministry for over 4 years, was due to retire at a time when he was involved in a number of matters which are at a critical stage, These include the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industry restructuring, executive-level mentorship, preparation of a new 5-year strategic plan 2017 to 2021, the conduct of energy policy consultations, renegotiation of key contract terms in existing production sharing contracts, finalization of cross-border and across-border discussions with Venezuela, and implementation of the transfer pricing modalities and renegotiations of the LNG contracts. In addition, Mr. Lashley was recently appointed head of a team whose mandate was to provide recommendations to the government for the restructuring of Petrotrin. He has also been government representative at the executive level at international fora, such as the Gas Exporting Countries Forum, GECF, and ULADI, and in the promotion of energy cooperation agreements with Guyana, Grenada, Cuba, and emerging energy provinces in Africa. In light of the foregoing, it was important that the services of Mr. Lashley be retained at an executive level to ensure the seamless continuity of the daily operations of the ministry and to provide expert advice and support to the minister on an ongoing basis. Accordingly, a recommendation was made to the Public Service Commission to the re-employment of Mr. Lashley as Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries for a period of 1 year, from March 17, 2017 to March 16, 2018. The Public Service, in accordance with Regulation 15 of the Public Service Regulations, agreed to the re-employment of Mr. Lashley for the period March 17, 2017 to March 16, 2018. In this regard, pursuant to the regulation, the request was reported to the Chief Personnel Officer, who consulted with the Public Services Association, which agreed to the re-employment of Mr. Lashley as Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries. Mr. Lashley is eminently qualified for the position. He holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in Chemical Engineering from the University of the West Indies, a Master's of Science degree in Natural Gas Technology from the Illinois Institute of Technology, and additionally, he holds a Bachelor's of Law degree from the University of London. I thank you, Madam President.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, could the Honourable Minister indicate to this House whether there is any form of succession planning at the level of the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industry?
Minister.
Madam President, the issue of succession planning is something that plagues the entire public service. It is not unique to the Ministry of Energy. However, because the Ministry of Energy has specialized skills that is needed to run the ministry, sometimes succession planning becomes a challenge. And basically, the major challenge is remuneration. Because if you are a highly skilled energy expert, the government cannot pay you to work in the Ministry of Energy. So there are people who has the commitment and who has had a long career in the energy sector. They have done human service. Right now, we are in a recruitment process. As you would see, the Public Service Commission has given the Permanent Secretary responsibility in 5 ministries, including the Ministry of Energy, to recruit its own staff, especially at a technical level, and a succession plan is now being put in place. And we hope to attract young, bright scholars, and more importantly, to retain them.
Madam President, is the Minister aware that there are highly qualified, I should say, Madam President, personnel at the Ministry of Energy at this time who could have easily replaced Mr. Selwyn Lashley? And why were those persons overlooked by the executive?
Minister.
I wouldn't dare say anything ill of my staff at the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industry, but after considering all our options, we found it fit to offer Mr. Lashley an extension of 1 year for continuity and the wealth of experience that he has. It does not mean that you don't have people in a succession plan, but 1 year I don't think will hurt the succession plan in terms of the upcoming professionals, but we really needed him for this extra year.
Madam President, is the Minister aware that under the Civil Service Regulations 14A, subsection 2, that this appointment could go up to 5 years? And is the minister aware that the extension of this period as the gentleman enters the retirement zone could go as much as 5 years? Are you aware of this?
Yes, I have the regulations in front of me, 14.8.2. It does say that it can be extended for 1 year, but maybe renewed annually for up to 5 years. We haven't, as I told you last week. No. Don't jump ahead of yourself. All we have done is extend them for 1 year. I am quite confident that within the year, the succession plan will be very, very much operational, and I do not foresee any major extension beyond the year.
Exactly. And this is where I'm coming, Madam President. Is the minister prepared to give this Parliament, this Senate, the undertaking that within 1 year there will be a smooth transition from the individual who currently occupies to a new person, so that you can have a breathing and exhaling of personnel whose mobility is not being stifled as a result of that decision?
Obviously, I can't give an absolute guarantee, but we will make our best effort to make sure that the succession plan works.
Senator Mark, next question.
Thank you, Madam President. Question number 80 to the Honorable Minister of National Security.
Minister of National Security.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, the Ministry of National Security and the Police Complaints Authority continue to treat with the targeting and removal of police officers who are classified as rogue officers. Any such action, however, Madam President, must be in accordance with the provisions of the law. The Police Service Regulation outlines the process to be followed for discipline and dismissal of a police officer. According to the said regulation, the Commissioner of Police can remove an officer in the public interest and impose the relevant penalties in disciplinary proceedings. The regulations also state, Madam President, that an officer who is suspended shall report in person once a month to the head of the division in the area in which he lives, and the head of that division shall report in writing to the Commissioner of Police. Further, Madam President, regulations provide for an officer who is charged with a criminal offense and is brought before the court to be simultaneously processed, as outlined in the regulations, where such officer is convicted, to be terminated from employment. Madam President.
Senator Mark, yes.
Could the Honorable Minister indicate whether an audit has been done by the Ministry of National Security to determine the number of rogue elements in the police service that is undermining the integrity and credibility of the service?
Madam President, no such audit has been done by the Ministry of National Security. However, I want to put on the table that the manpower audit that is being done right now, that falls into part of the terms of reference for the manpower audit, Madam President.
Madam President, may I again, through you, ask the Honorable Minister, how many rogue elements or elements that are operating contrary to well-established police principles and methods and protocols have been removed from the police service for their illegal, unlawful activities?
Minister of National Security.
Madam President, I do not have that figure at this point, however it can be provided at a later date.
Madam President, in light of the action taken by elements of the police service to shut down the country through a day of policing, total policing, would you indicate to us whether any action by these elements, I do not know if you want to call them rogue elements, but do you believe that, for instance, action, or should I ask, Madam President, is any action being taken by the Ministry of National Security and the police service to deal with those elements who are responsible for that action?
Senator Mark, I won't allow that question. Senator Ramsey.
Recently, the police was supposed to engage in a massive exercise in central Trinidad, and the information was leaked. Could the Honorable Minister indicate, as a result of that leakage that took place, obviously by some rogue element, has the police been able to discover who was responsible for the leakage of that information?
Senator Mark, I won't allow that question. Senator Ramdeen.
Madam President, thank you. Madam President, through you to the Honourable Minister of National Security. Senator Mark asked about rogue officers. Does the ministry have any idea of how many officers in the police service are presently on suspension?
Minister of National Security.
Madam President, that number is available, however, I do not have it at this point in time. I'm sure that is available. I can get that from the police commissioner. That, because remember, disciplinary, according to police service regulations, is under the ambit of the Commissioner of Police.
Senator Mark, next question.
Thank you. Question number 81 to the Honorable Minister of National Security.
Minister of National Security.
Madam President. Madam President, the government has made a commitment to the enterprise community and to the citizenry at large, and it is our intention to honor that commitment to ensure that the police station is placed within the enterprise area, which we believe will be of benefit to the enterprise community. Madam President.
Madam President, could the Honorable Minister indicate whether the government has located has an area, I should ask, Madam President, been located by the Ministry of National Security for the construction of that police station in Enterprise?
Minister of National Security.
Madam President, the Ministry of National Security, together with the Commissioner of Police, we have looked at two areas with respect to the construction of the police station, and we're still deliberating based on which one would give us the best advantage to construct the police station. So we have looked at areas within the enterprise area.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, could the Honorable Minister indicate whether any consultations would have taken place with the Police Association on this whole question of establishing a police station in Enterprise?
Minister of National Security.
Madam President, no consultation took place with the Police Welfare Association. Consultation, however, took place with the Commissioner of Police and his divisional commanders. Madam President.
Madam President, would not the Minister agree with me that in an effort to promote better relations between the police and the administration and the government, that the principle of consultation on matters of the nature I have defined would have been a preferable course?
Senator Mark, I won't allow that question.
Well, could I also, as I'm on my legs, may I ask the Honorable Minister, is there a specific time frame that the government has in mind for the construction and occupation by police officers of this station in Enterprise?
Minister of National Security.
Madam President, there is no specific time frame. However, the police station Enterprise will be constructed as soon as possible.
Public Business, Government Business Bills, second reading.
Minister of Labour and Small Enterprise Development.
Thank you, Madam President. I beg to move that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Fire Service Act, Chapter 3550, be now read a second time. Madam President, before I proceed, I crave your indulgence, Madam President, under Standing Order 4211. Madam President, The bill that is presented this afternoon to the Senate treats with the amendment of the Fire Service Act, Chapter 3550. The bill is a very short bill, short but very effective, as it seeks to amend the Fire Service Act to allow for the payment of pensions and gratuities for fire officers who have been acting in the higher position for a continuous period of 3 years prior to retirement. Madam President, the bill essentials outline. Clause 1 sets out the short title of the bill. Clause 2 provides for the amendment of paragraph 3 of the 5th schedule of the Fire Service Act by the insertion of the proposed subclauses 7A, B, and C. The proposed clause 7A provides that a fire officer who has acted in the higher office for a continuous period of at least 3 years immediately prior to the date of his compulsory retirement, or acts in that higher position prior to proceeding on annual leave before the date of his compulsory retirement, shall be eligible to have his pension gratuity or other allowance calculated as if he were substantively appointed to that higher office. Subclause 7AB proposes that a fire officer who satisfies these requirements shall be required to pay arrears of contribution calculated on the basis of the pay he would have received in that higher office had he been substantively appointed. Subclause 7B proposes that arrears of contribution which is payable shall be determined on the basis of the pay the fire officer would have received in that higher office for each year in respect of which he acted continuously, and deducted as a lump sum from the gratuity payable to the fire officer where practicable, or from the fire officer's pension in equal monthly installments over a period to be determined by the Comptroller of Accounts. And subclause 7C seeks to make the aforementioned subclauses applicable to fire officers in the 1st Division and the 2nd Division who compulsorily retire or who had compulsorily retired from the fire service on or after January 1, 2008. Madam President, I stand here today to pilot this bill with such pride, with such joy, because you see, Madam President, on the 7th day of November 2003, in my other capacity as president of the Public Services Association, I would have, my team and I at that time, would have negotiated this particular term and condition and signed off on it with the Chief Personnel Officer, Ms. Sandra Marshak, former Chief Personnel Officer, on the 7th day of November 2003. So I am really delighted, Madam President, to round off, so to speak, the last peg of those officers who should have been enjoying this retirement benefit. Madam President, the Fire Service Act, Chapter 3550, makes provision for the establishment of the Trinidad and Tobago Fire Service and identifies the purposes of the said fire service to include at Section 3A, and I quote, the saving and protection of life or property from damage or destruction by fire or other hazards, whether fire-related or not, and to render humanitarian services where required. Madam President, the 5th schedule of the said Fire Service Act regulates the payment of pensions, gratuities, and other allowances to be granted in respect of the services of fire officers. Based on the provision of Clause 3 of the 5th schedule, specifically at subclause 7, the calculation of a fire officer's pension does not take into consideration where a fire officer may have acted in a higher position continuously for a considerable period immediately prior to retirement. Of course, Madam President, such a situation is not a fair one. After a public officer, and in this case, a fire officer, who may have worked many, many years in the fire service, may have acted for more than 3 years in the higher post, and would have retired without his pension benefits being calculated at that higher level. His pension benefits would have been calculated in the substantive position. And of course, we will all agree that is neither fair nor just. Madam President, it is no secret that our labor legislation is in need of amendment. I prefer to call them creatures of our time. And for many of the pieces of labor legislation, their time is long gone, and they no longer effectively address the rights and obligations of employees as well as employers in this country. Today, Madam President, with this bill, this government continues its trust to provide for our public officers of this country. And in so doing, Madam President, this bill provides for the payment of pensions and gratuities for fire officers acting in the higher post for a period of 3 years or more in a continuous capacity. Madam President, in the official policy framework of the government of Trinidad and Tobago, the commitment to fostering proper industrial relation practices is quite clear. We committed, Madam President, to reviewing and modernizing the labor legislative framework, recognizing that it is the linchpin of an effective industrial relations system. And Madam President, I'm proud to say we have been delivering. Quietly, we at the Ministry of Labor have been doing our homework, and I will share a little later on, Madam President, the outcome of the hard work that we have been doing with a very efficient, committed, and loyal team of public officers. Madam President, we committed to dialogue. We committed to regular consultation. We committed to regular interaction with the labor movement and the employers of this country on all areas of policy, projects, and programs affecting the rights and interests of workers, labor, and employers generally. We committed to produce a clear framework of rights and responsibilities in the workplace. We also committed to facilitating tripartite engagement between government, labor, and employer to foster and develop a peaceful, competitive, and productive industrial relations climate. Madam President, and here we are again, once more delivering on our commitment to improve the lives of not only public officers, but the citizenry of our beautiful Twin Island state. Madam President, the need to modernize the legislative framework to ensure that workers' and employers' rights and responsibilities are upheld cannot be underemphasized. Madam President, it is critical that an appropriate legislative environment is created, especially one which is able to protect the more than 580,000 persons employed in Trinidad and Tobago, as well as those who will be joining the labor market within the future. This bill will no doubt translate, hopefully, into increased enthusiasm, increased productivity, and ultimately, even better service from our hard-working and courageous fire officers. It must also be noted that this bill will give effect to a cabinet decision of March 22nd, 2012, whereby cabinet agreed that the Attorney General should amend the 5th schedule of the Fire Service Act to give effect to the terms of the Memorandum of Agreement between the Chief Personnel Officer and the Fire Service Association of Trinidad and Tobago, the 2nd Division, which is dated March 6, 2012, for the period January 1st, 2008 to December 31st, 2010. This bill, Madam President, will ensure that fire officers are entitled to have superannuation benefits of the higher position upon retirement, as do all other public officers, dating back to 2003. Public officers such as teachers, prison officers, and police officers. Madam President, with this bill, this government is giving effect to the principles of decent work, which actually speaks to the provision of opportunities for work that delivers a fair income, work that is productive, security in the workplace, and social protection for families. Madam President, this bill also provides for basic income security by ensuring that a fire officer is entitled to have superannuation benefits of the higher position upon retirement, whether he is promoted to that position or not. Madam President, this bill speaks to the 3rd pillar of decent work, that is the enhancement of social protection, as it protects fire officers from the vulnerabilities and contingencies of work in respect of payment of pensions and gratuities by ensuring a fair pension for a fire officer who has acted in a higher position prior to his or her retirement. This will allow for fire officers to be paid a fair and regular income upon their retirement, and thus allow for greater security and support in their retirement, their twilight years. Madam President, this bill presented today represents a way of thinking which is progressive and developmental, and having been approved by Cabinet since 2012, is long overdue. It is only a signal of the start of more legislative changes to be brought to this House, and also in the other place, I'm sure, pertaining to the rights and responsibilities of employees and employers. On the legislative front, you would recall, Madam President, that the Ministry of Labor and Small Enterprise Development has some 22 pieces of legislation, labor legislation, under its purview, the reform of each being of great importance. These pieces of legislation are outdated with the Employment Exchange Act, Chapter 8809, being 98 years old, Madam President. We have identified 10 pieces of labor legislation as legislative priorities of the ministry and which forms part of this government's agenda. Permit me a moment, Madam President, to note that the legislative priorities include amendments as follows: to the Industrial Relations Act, the Retrenchment and Severance Benefits Act, Chapter 8813, the Workmen's Compensation Act, Chapter 8805, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, Chapter 8808, the Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies, Chapter 3951, the Friendly Societies Act, Chapter 3205, the Cooperative Societies Act, Chapter 8103, legislation in respect of the private security sector, legislation aimed at the prevention and elimination of child labor, and legislation outlining basic terms and conditions of work for all citizens of this country, Madam President, who would enter the labor market. These legislative priorities are key to this administration fulfilling its responsibility for the prescription and protection of the rights and duties of workers and employers. It is projected that by 2020, Madam President, these pieces of legislation will be revised. Not a promise, Madam President, but a commitment to deliver by 2020. Madam President, in keeping with the priorities identified within our labor legislative agenda, the Ministry of Labor and Small Enterprise Development has undertaken 11 much anticipated, genuine national tripartite stakeholder consultations over the course of 16 non-consecutive days beginning in January 2016. And that first consultation, Madam President, mere months after assuming duties, that consultation began with the Cooperative Societies Act, and that consultation was held over a 2-day period, the 13th and 14th of January 2016 in Trinidad, and in Tobago, January the 29th. Madam President, the consultation on the amendment of the Industrial Relations Act occurred on the 22nd of February 2016 in Trinidad and on the 8th of April 2016 in Tobago. The consultation on reducing our dependency on contract labor, an issue, Madam President, that is cause of grave concern throughout the length and breadth of the public service as well as the private sector. And this government is committed to reducing that dependency on contract labor and, where necessary, converting those positions to permanent pensionable positions. And that consultation was held on the 13th of April 2016. Madam President, the consultation on the Retrenchment and Severance Benefits Act occurred on the 18th of May 2016. The consultation on the Basic Terms and Conditions of Work Code was held on the 29th of June 2016. The consultation of Friendly Societies was held on the 23rd of November 2016, followed by a consultation of lodges in Trinidad and Tobago on the 24th of January 2017. Madam President, in the year 2017, on the 25th of January, we held a consultation on the review of the Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies, followed closely by a consultation on the review of the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which was held on the 21st and 22nd of March in Trinidad, and the Tobago consultation will be held on the 4th of July, Madam President. Our most recent consultation was held on the, sorry, Madam President, on the 26th of April 2017 on the Workmen's Compensation Act. So we have been extremely busy, quietly busy. We are not on any rooftop, Madam President, shouting, but we are doing the work with a loyal, committed, and hard-working team of public officers who, Madam President, I am proud to say they are not clock watchers, and they are going beyond the call of duty, and I'm proud to be working with them, Madam President. So, Madam President, as we present this bill today, I believe that this government has again demonstrated its commitment to excellence in its service to the people of our beautiful Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. I am happy to advise, Madam President, that arising out of all those consultations, and the consultation had 3 waves of consultation, Madam President. I did not even go into the dates of the other consultation where working groups were appointed with all the stakeholders, so they had a second bite at the cherry and a third bite whereby they could have submitted their further comments and views. Madam President, I stand here very happy to advise that there are now 3 draft policy position papers before the Cabinet, which would inform the amendment to the legislation. And they refer to the amendment of the Cooperative Act, the amendment of the Industrial Relations Act, and the amendment of the retrenchment.
Madam President, on a point of order, 46-1.
Minister of Labour, while you have given a broad context, I think you should actually try and deal now with the bill itself, okay?
Thank you, Madam President. As a matter of fact, Madam President, that statement was my final statement to take me into my closing remarks. Prematurity. Madam President, in closing, the presentation of this bill demonstrates our resolve to fulfill our commitments to the people of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. In that context, I wish to express my gratitude for being permitted another opportunity to demonstrate the effectiveness of this government in addressing labor and industrial relations matters, and for reaffirming that we are indeed seeking the best interests of our workers. Madam President, I thank you.
Minister, I need some...
President, I beg to move.
Honourable Senators, I shall now propose the question for debate. The question is that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Fire Service Act, Chapter 3550, be now read a second time. Senator Mark.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, on the issue of pension for public officers, in this instance, firefighters, or what we call fire service officers, who can object? Who can oppose? Who cannot but support measures that are designed to improve, as the Honourable Minister said, the quality of life as those officers, as we all will eventually enter into that twilight zone of life called retirement. So no one could object to legislation that is designed to to enhance the superannuation benefits of a public officer. But in making my contribution today on this very important piece of legislation, I want to indicate from the very outset, Madam President, that I find the fire service and I find firefighters as an element or an arm within the protective services sector. Sometimes they are treated as almost third-class citizens.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
They seem to be bastardized. They seem like when our parents came from Africa and India and they had us, during that period, we were defined as illegitimates. And they seem, Madam President, to be in a world of their own as they struggle to save lives. They put their lives forward to save other lives and to protect and save properties from destruction.
Yes.
And many fire officers, Madam President, have perished in this particular exercise. Madam President, there are managerial challenges facing the fire service of this country. There is a lack of equipment facing the fire service. When you travel on Rice Road, sometimes you look at the fire station that is supposed to be the headquarters of the fire service of Trinidad and Tobago, and you feel that you are back in times in terms of buildings, because it hasn't been modernized. There has been no reconstruction of the fire service headquarters on Rice Road. It is dilapidated, and it is almost a shameful manifestation of what is supposed to be a fire headquarters in Trinidad and Tobago. Not to mention, Madam President, the poor accommodation. Madam President, you would have read some time ago where a fire officer had to leave that building in Point Fortin and place their dormitory and mattresses on the road because a building that has been condemned by OSHA, thank you. The fire services and the administration and the executive didn't take any steps to either find a new building for these officers. So they actually had to leave that condemned building and actually occupy the streets. How can you treat your fire officers and your firefighters in that way? So when I hear the Honorable Minister of Labor, speaking in such glowing terms about the fire service, and the Honorable Minister is proud to move such a piece of legislation, I think that the Honorable Minister has forgotten the state, the conditions that the fire officers are faced with on a daily basis. And Madam President, I will come to the issue of the measure that is before us, because it seems to me that it is tackling symptoms and not the problem. The cause is the absence of regular promotion in the fire service. The cause is the failure of the Public Service Commission and the Chief Fire Officer. I have a legal notice before me where the Public Service Commission, Madam President, in 2006 delegated authority through legal notice number 105 in 2006 to the chief fire officer to promote, Madam President, that level called sub-fire officers. Sub-fire officers. Or they call it sub-fire station officers. I think that's the correct concept and term or title. And you know what, Madam President? Recently, in December last year, close to 400 fire officers were promoted. About 200, over 200 were sub-fire station officers. They are the low rank, like corporals, in the police service. But prior to that, Madam President, the last time they got promotions within the fire service was 2010. And the previous time was 2005. So it is why, Madam President, you had officers acting like Hollywood. Like if they're in Hollywood, Madam President, for 4, 5, 6 years. And Madam President, when they go and they reach compulsory retirement, Madam President, they go home with a retirement pension at their substantive level. So if I were a sub-fire station officer and they give me an appointment as a divisional fire officer to act, which is high up the range, Madam President, I am getting 2,000 here, but acting there, I would get about 6,000. Madam President, when retirement comes, I would get pension at the rate of $2,000, even though I have been acting for 10 years as in this particular position. And Madam President, many fire officers and fighters have gone home at that level. Some of them are almost like semi-vagrants in this country. And Madam President, it is really sad that it has taken, I agree with the Honorable Minister of Labor when she was in another incarnation as PSA President. In 2002, 2003, the Honorable Minister then was able to negotiate for civil servants who were acting in a higher position to be properly compensated, meaning when they act in a higher office and they are about to leave at the age of 60, Madam President, they will go at that rate of pay for calculating pension purposes or for calculating pensions. That is what, but you know what? Civil servants and other public officers got that good treatment in 2002, 2003. It may have taken effect in 2004. The police got their treatment, like the civil servants, in 2005. The prison officers got theirs in 2007. But look, we are in 2017, and the fire officers, the bastardized, they are almost, Madam President, as if they are outcasts. And we are now dealing with their matter in 2017. Why? Madam President, the Honorable Minister told us a short while ago that there was an agreement signed off between 2008, for the period 2008 to 2010. When that was done, Madam President? In 2012. The People's National Movement was in office between 2002 to 2010, and they refused to enter into any serious collective agreement with the Fire Officers 2nd Division. So it took a PP government in 2012 to sign off, Madam President, this collective agreement for the period 2008 to 2010. And it was in 2015 that the Fire Officers 2nd Division were able to sign off 2011 to 2013, and they are still waiting for 2014 to 2016. So they were able to get 2 collective agreements under the watch, under the stewardship, under the leadership of a very progressive government called the People's Partnership. And that is why, Madam President, I take umbrage when the Minister of Finance, I missed him today because I wanted to deal with him. Why, Madam President, when I say deal with him, to engage him? That's what I'm talking about. That's right. Yeah, not to deal with him otherwise, you know. I'm dealing with engaging. Right. So, Madam President, when the Honorable Minister of Finance tells the country that we saddled them, that is the PNM, with a $5 billion bill to pay as back pay, Madam President, we were dealing with matters that they were supposed to deal with, and they failed to deal with it. So what must we do, Madam President, with those firefighters in 2012 when they came to us to sign off a collective agreement for 2008 to 2010? Run them? Tell them wait. Tell them wait? We had no choice. So we had to sign the collective agreement, Madam President, to get that going for the officers in question. Madam President, there is a provision in this amendment called the Act, an act rather to amend the Fire Service Act, which speaks to the role of the Controller of Accounts, which I'll come to in a short while. But I want to let you know, Madam President, that there are 2 fire services in the Republic of TNT. There is the Fire Service Act. It is called Fire Service Act, Chapter 3550. And there is something called the Auxiliary Fire Service Act. I think it is 3555, if I'm not mistaken. And Madam President, may his soul rest in peace. He was my teacher when I was a pupil, a student, I should say, at the institute called Progressive Educational Institute. And Martin Joseph, may his soul rest in peace. He taught me history. And I had the distinct opportunity of going with a delegation from the fire service, the auxiliary fire officers, to the Ministry of National Security under his leadership to do what, Madam President? To make representation for those auxiliary fire officers who haven't served in the auxiliary fire service. And they served for 10 and 12 years and 15 years, Madam President. And when they made the transition to the fire service as regular fire officers, Madam President, their services were not considered. That's right. So you would have served in the auxiliary fire service, Madam President, for 15 years. And then you moved across to the regular fire service. And you might have reached there at the age of 30, because some people join the auxiliary from the age of 18 and 19. And they serve for 10 years or 15 years. And they go across at the age of 30. Under the Fire Service Act and the regulations governing the fire service, Madam President, you must leave the service at the age of 55. That is retirement age for these officers at the rank of the fire station officers. So you could imagine, Madam President, you served as an auxiliary fire officer for 15 years. So from 18 to, let's say, you come across, let's say, just for argument's sake, 18, 20, 30, 33. And you have 34, 44. You have about another 13 years to serve, 14 years before you reach 55. Madam President, you will only be granted pensions calculated for the 15 years or thereabouts that you would have served in the regular fire service. Madam President, that was wrong. That was wrong. And we made representation to the Honorable Minister of National Security at that time, the Honorable Martin Joseph. As I said, may his soul rest in peace. And Madam President, we came to the Parliament and an act was passed called Act number 22 of 2006. And that act of 2006, among other things, said that effective from January 1, 1991, a fire officer or retired fire officer who served as an auxiliary fire officer on a full-time basis immediately prior to his appointment as a fire officer shall be entitled to have both periods of service computed for purposes of the grant of pension. That was under Martin Joseph. It was, we had to protest. We have to put PNM against the wall. We have to put you against the wall, Madam President, in order to get this passed. Like the Honorable Minister didn't hear me. I told her I was like her with my union cap representing the auxiliary fire officers at the Ministry of National Security. Just as how you represented your workers and you signed off, I represented fire officers without being involved in any union, but using my trade union experience to extract this legislation for them. So yes, the PNM piloted it, but we were the ones who pushed the PNM. Without pushing them and forcing them, we wouldn't have got this. So I want to thank the Honorable Minister, who is now dead, for pushing this and advancing this. Madam President. But you know, Madam President, great is the PNM, it shall die. Madam President, let me tell you something. Madam President, let me tell you something, Madam President. Madam President, let me tell you something. Madam President, you know what is sad about this whole thing, Madam President? You know what is sad about this whole exercise? We are talking about, great is this and great is that. Madam President, this bill was passed in 2006. Madam President, it was assented to by the President of the Republic. Madam President, they have never operationalized this bill up to this time as we speak. This bill has not been operationalized, Madam President. Madam President, this bill was passed by the PNM. It was never operationalized. No, I am dealing with an issue affecting, and this bill is number 22 of 2006. So, Madam President, if you pass a bill in 2006 and you knew the challenges facing the auxiliary fire officers, and Madam President, this was effected up to January 1st, 1991. Madam President, 1991. Madam President, Madam President, how many auxiliary fire officers who have left the service have died. Yes. They have died, and they have not gotten their pension, Madam President, because of the fact that the government of the Republic of TNT did not operationalize this piece of legislation, Act number 22 of 2006. So that is why when my friend was saying great is this and great is that, I told her pause, because yes, they passed it, but they never put it into effect, Madam President. Now, Madam President, you know why I raise this with you and this Honorable House? We are here again debating another measure. Will it have the same faith as this one had in 2006? That's the question, Madam President. Would it have the same fate? Would it suffer the same consequences as a result? Of course I'm supporting the bill. But I am outlining to the Honorable President and to this Honorable House the deficiencies, the flaws, right, involved in rushing things and not really effective exploiting them. And that is what I'm concerned about, Madam President. What are we going to be doing, Madam President, to compensate all those families whose fathers and whose loved ones have died without receiving a pension, without receiving their pension? That is what is the main concern of my person this evening, Madam President. Madam President, so that's a very important area of concern that I raise. So when we talk about decent work, and we talk about social protection, and we talk about a fair and decent pension, you must be able to meet your obligations, Madam President. Meet your obligations to these people. Madam President, I want to refer you to the Fire Service Terms and Conditions of Employment Regulations 1998. It is legal notice number 206, and it was issued in 1998. I go to page 1374, and I'm looking at part 5. It deals with payment of pension. And I want to quote 43 subs 1. The computation and authorization of pensions and gratuities of officers whose retirement from the service is known to be impending shall be treated as urgent matters of high priority. It goes on. The Chief Fire Officer, through the Permanent Secretary, shall ensure that particulars of service and pay of each officer whose retirement is known to be imminent are furnished accurately to the Comptroller of Accounts not less than 6 calendar months before the date on which the officer concerned is due to retire. In order to enable the computation and checking of pensions, retiring allowances, and gratuities to be completed by the Comptroller of Accounts and the Auditor General and submitted for authorization before the date on which the officer's retirement from the service is due to take effect. Madam President, this is Regulation 41 sub 1, 41 sub 2. What is the practice? Madam President, public officers, be you a public officer, be you a civil servant, be you a contract officer, be you a member of Parliament, be you a police officer, be you a firefighter, Madam President, it does not matter. You inevitably will get your pension 2 years after you retire in this country.
If you're lucky.
We have been waiting for our little kakada here in this place. It is now 20 months, and members of Parliament who served in the last Parliament are yet to get their gratuities. Right. In this Parliament, just as an example, Madam President, I am advised that there are several firefighters who are waiting for their retirement pension for months into years. They cannot get their pensions, Madam President. Why? Because, Madam President, this section of the regulation that says that all your documents, Madam President, must reach the Comptroller 6 months before you go on retirement, so that they can do the computation, make sure the records are properly organized. So, Madam President, if you leave next week, within 2 weeks, you shall receive your gratuity check, and at the end of the following month, you get your monthly pension. That is how it's supposed to be. But, Madam President, you know that there are over 50,000 persons in the public service. Do you know that? Do you know, Madam President, as we speak, we have close to 15,000 contract officers in the public service, and every 3 years, once they roll over, they are entitled to gratuity, and the Controller of Accounts and the Auditor General combined have to do whatever computation they have to do, Madam President, for you to get your piece. Do you know that there are close to 20,000 daily rated employees in this country? And the Controller of Accounts also have a role to play in that. But, Madam President, what is the reality? The reality is that the Controller of Accounts, this problem is public administration, it is the Ministry of Finance, it is the Auditor General, and, Madam President, what is happening is that there is a severe shortage of staff in all of those critical areas, particularly in the Office of the Controller of Accounts. So, Madam President, you know, these public hearings that we have been having, I must tell you, they are very rich in terms of information that they bring to the attention of the general population. The Public Accounts Committee held a meeting on the 22nd of June 2016, and the Comptroller was there, as well as the then Permanent Secretary, Mr. Sweet, in the Ministry of Finance. And the question of pensions came up, Madam President, and they asked him, Mr. Sweet, for some of the reasons for the ability, for the reason why the pensions management branch is unable to pay pensions on time. And the first reason he gave was the expansion of the public service in the 70s and the 80s. And those people, like the baby boomers, are now about to retire, and they are coming out in droves, and therefore they don't have the staff to deal with those people. So the first reason Mr. Sweet advanced at that time was the issue of the expansion of the public service in the 70s and the 80s. The second reason he attributed for the absence, Madam President, of this inability of the Comptroller of Accounts to meet her pension obligations is the proliferation of persons on contract employment in the public service. That's the second reason. The third reason, Madam President, he gave was the presence of daily rated workers in the system that the Comptroller also has to address. He talked about the realignment of ministries that also contributed to the confusion as it relates to records and documentation. That's another reason that Mr. Sweet advanced for the chaos that took place. He also made mention of the action taken by the PSA. I don't think the Honorable Leader was there. That is when I say PSA President at that time. I think it was your successor who had problems, and they shut down, as you recall, the office. And as a result of that shutdown of the Comptroller and the Treasury offices, Mr. Sweet is saying that a backlog built up, and they have never been able to recover from that backlog, Madam President. So, Madam President, contract workers, the backlog, and most importantly, staffing. The staffing structure of the Treasury Division needs to be corrected. There is not the right mix of staff, given the size of the public service, as well as the number of contract officers in the public service. So the staffing structure is one of the reasons also at the Comptroller of Accounts. So, Madam President, a number of reasons were advanced for this situation. And I do not know if the government has taken any action, Madam President, to deal with this matter. I remember that in 2009, when the former Minister of Finance dealt with public pension reform. At that time, in 2007, although the budget was read in 2009, the Honorable Karen Teixeira indicated that the liability of the government in terms of public pension was between 22 to 30 billion dollars as at the 1st of January 2007. That was only at the 1st of January 2007. So we don't know as we speak today, Madam President, what is the government's liability in terms of pensions in the public service. In 2007, it was close to $30 billion. That is those people, Madam President, in the system, and they were projecting when they will retire and the amount of payments that the government will have to make. Because as you know, Madam President, the system that we have today is it is not a defined contributory plan. It is a defined benefit plan. So we do not contribute. In other words, whilst we pay who are on the pension system, the bulk of the public officers in the system do not pay. Madam President, they do not pay. And that's a problem. And that is why this issue of pension reform is a matter that we need to pay attention to. I think Jamaica, under the IMF watch, has now been able to reform their public pension system because they had no choice because they were under the IMF. I don't know if we are waiting for the IMF to come here to tell us how to reform the public pension system in Trinidad and Tobago, Madam President. But it is a challenge that we have, and it is very big, and it's very huge, Madam President. So, Madam President, I want to raise one final area for your attention: delegation of authority. Madam President, I read somewhere, and the Honorable Minister of Energy boasted today that the Public Service Commission has delegated authority to 6 ministries, including his ministry, to recruit public officers generic to their ministry or his ministry. They will advertise, they will hire, and they will discipline. So the recruiting and the disciplining. But you know, Madam President, I looked all over. I asked the legal department here to get for me a legal notice, Madam President, because that doesn't happen like that. I have a legal notice in my hand where the Public Service Commission in 2006 delegated authority to the Chief Fire Officer. It is in a legal notice. But we are being told by the PNM that the Public Service Commission has granted these ministries, Madam President, the power to recruit and the power to discipline. Where is the legal notice? I have not seen the legal notice yet.
5 more minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam President. So, Madam President, I raise this question about delegated authority to come to page 16 of the Public Service Commission report and to show that even though this was delegated to the fire service through its chief fire officer since 2006, the chief fire officer and the Public Service Commission still were not able to make any promotion in the fire service for 2006, 7, 8, 9, and 10, even though they had delegated powers. They did promotion in 2010. In 2011, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, until December, Madam President, no promotions. Promotion took place, Madam President, in December of 2016, where they promoted about 400 fire officers. So I just want to let the Honorable Minister know that You don't get delegated authority just so. And I have some worries, but that's another time. I have a matter I think I filed, so I'll be premature. I don't want to go there. I'll reserve my fire for then, not now. Madam President, so in closing, Madam President, I want to let you know that we support the measure that is before us to give these officers the opportunity who are acting in higher offices to grant them pensions in those offices once they reach retirement age and they're about to leave. We have no problem with that. But Madam President, I am saying to you and to this honorable House that the problem is deeper than that. Yes. The problem is the absence of the Public Service Commission and the Chief Fire Officer working together to have appointments made and promotions made and vacancy filled so you don't have actors in the system as we are having at the present time. So that is where the problem lies. The problem lies, Madam President, in the absence of a system of regular promotion in the public service to avoid this conundrum and difficulty that is being faced by public officers. So I want to say, Madam President, in closing, that while some public officers are dying and they cannot get their pension, I saw an audit firm called Ernst & Young getting some $20 million in audit fees to conduct audits. And Madam President, I've also seen where a company and a financier of the PNM, a fellow called David Brush, have a vessel called MV Transporter. And if I understand what he's getting on a daily basis in US dollars, Madam President, he will be getting close to $8 to $9 million at the end of this year. So, Madam President, whilst ordinary people can't get their pension, whilst ordinary people are dying because they can't get a pension, people who are financiers and supporters
point of order, Madam President,
are getting it easily. Madam President, I thank you very much.
Senator Mahabir.
Madam President, I begin with thanks. And I think everybody in this chamber, government, opposition, and independents, know my position on pensions. Yes. Let me summarize that position. Let me summarize that position. Our position, my position on pensions, Madam President, is that it is such a critical matter, it should not be politicized. It should rather be rationalized. And it should be reformed. And it does not matter whether the pension holder is the highest office holder in our land for which there is legislation, or the least paid workers in Trinidad and Tobago. We need to look at our pension legislations to ensure that there is no inequity, there is no discrimination, and that we understand pensions in all its manifestations so we could continually reform it. Madam President, this is a very short bill. And because it is short, there are things I don't know that I would like to know. And the first that I would like to know, there are only two clauses. The first matter that I would like to know really is certainly the Ministry of Finance Pensions Division would have had the number of officers involved. And given the actual numbers, this bill does not refer to all retired officers, but only those who were acting during their career and who were not confirmed in their position, and therefore we would now amend the legislation so that they would obtain a pension based upon the position in which they acted in. So it could not be a tremendous amount of persons. And I am sure the pensions division would have been able to give us physical numbers, and therefore I would have been able to determine what the cost to the state is going to be on account of this provision. We are, after all, and we are being told on a daily basis, that there is a huge gap. The maximum amount of revenues collected by the Honorable Minister is 40 billion. He says 37, but it could vary between 37 and 40. And since there is a gap of around 10 billion, we must always be mindful of the cost. But given my knowledge of these matters, I think the cost is going to be trivial. But it really would have been good to know how many officers were involved. Second, Madam President, it would also have been beneficial, since my view on pensions is that it ought to be... Yes, I will give way that.
I just wanted to be clear the question you were asking. You wanted to know how many officers will benefit from this, from the passage of this piece of legislation? Yes,
okay. Yes, Madam President. I wanted to know how many officers would benefit, because it has implications not only for cost, it has implications for whether, as Senator Mark alluded, the commission responsible for promotion is really efficient or inefficient. And if there are many officers who acted and who were not confirmed, then it is sending a signal to me as a legislator that maybe we ought to look at the efficiency of the promotions process so that the matter does not arise in the future. So that I really would like to know, to get that bit of information. I am sure it is available. Normally in a computerized system, one simply has to go issue a command, all officers who have acted and who are in receipt of a pension, and we could get the numbers. I suspect it is not that way organized. Madam President, there is a second issue, and I am sure the Honorable Minister of Labour would have paid some attention to it. And the question to be raised is this: is it that it is only fire officers who are affected by this provision, or are there other officers of the state for whom arrangements ought to be made? I am not sure. For example, prison officers, are they similarly circumstanced as fire officers, and do we have to address their concern? Nurses in the RHA? I don't know, and I think the Minister of Labour would be in the best position. Okay. Right. The third point I'd want to raise, Madam President, is this. The clause that I want to focus on is clause 2, and that is, it says a fire officer who has acted in a higher office, and I will return to this clause later on in my contribution, has acted in a higher office for a continuous period, so that we are not adding a 3-month here and a 6-month here. He must be, or she must be acting for a continuous period of at least 3 years, immediately prior to the date of his compulsory retirement. It is immediately prior to the date. And I'm just wondering whether we do not need to relook at this, because take an officer who has acted in a higher position for 3 years. He has 2 months to go before retirement, but his superior returns from a 3-year study leave, completed his, I'd imagine, degree or whatever, returns, and the officer who has acted for 3 years returns to his position for 2 months, and when he goes on retirement, of course, because the service was not continuous, although he has acted for 3 years, he is not in any way going to be compensated for having acted for 3 years, although the period between him acting and his retiring might just be a few months. And I'm wondering whether it is government's policy that in that situation, we don't consider giving them a lump sum to compensate for the fact that they were not the beneficiary via the luck of the draw for not having acted continuously onto retirement. So, Madam President, I know the Honorable Minister will let us know what is happening with respect to other areas of the public service. She said she mentioned it, but it may have missed me. But whether there are other workers similarly circumstanced, the number of officers, and whether consideration will be given to officers whose service, while continuous, may have been truncated a few months before their retirement, so that this matter of continuity, therefore, affects them adversely. Madam President, I was just wondering, you see, where this clause 2 emanated from. It says a fire officer, under clause 2, a fire officer who has acted in a higher office for a continuous period of at least 3 years immediately prior to the date of his compulsory retirement shall be eligible to have his pension, gratuity, or other allowance calculated as if he was substantively appointed to that higher office. This clause, Madam President, came from somewhere. It was lifted from somewhere. And from where was it lifted? I consulted, Madam President, Act 2352, the Pensions Act of Trinidad and Tobago. And what 2352, this 2352 Pensions Act was first passed, it was Act number 16 of 1934, amended, of course, on a number of occasions subsequently. But what does 16A of this Pension Act tell us? 16A of the Pensions Act of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago says, where an officer who immediately prior to the date of his compulsory retirement or the date on which he proceeds on annual leave prior to the date of compulsory retirement has acted in a higher office for a period of 3 continuous years, that officer shall be eligible to have his pension, gratuity, or other allowance calculated as if he were confirmed in that higher office, and for the purpose of computing such pension, gratuity, or other allowance, he shall be deemed to be an officer to whom Regulation 11A of the regulation applies. And the regulations then spelled out the conditions under which he will collect said pension. So here it is, Madam President. We have before us a bill, 2 clauses, aimed at amending the Fire Services Act 3505, and the substantive clause in this bill has been lifted from the Pensions Act governing Trinidad and Tobago 2352. Now, when I read this Pension Act 16A, nowhere did it indicate that there was a date from which 16A would come into effect. I am sure that legal officers, the Chief Parliamentary Counsel, will be able to give some advice, but 16A to me is the law of the land. It is an Act of Parliament 2352 clearly spelling out that there is an officer who is entitled to obtain the pension even though he acted, so that what we are doing with this particular bill is simply following the law as stated in the Pensions Act. And that what concerns me, Madam President, is this. What concerns me is that we are saying under clause 2 of the under clause 2 of the bill, the very last subclause, it says subclause 7A and 7B shall apply to fire officers in the 1st Division and the 2nd Division who compulsorily retire on or who had retired from the fire service on or after the 1st of January 2008. So I did not see a truncated date in the Pensions Act, which is the law, but I am seeing a date of 2008 in this fire services bill. There has to be good reasons for mentioning 2008, but Madam President, if I were a fire service officer who retired in 2007 in an acting position, and I saw my colleague who retired in 2008 in an acting position in receipt of a higher pension than I am now receiving, I will simply ask, why does this 16A not apply to me? Because collective agreements notwithstanding, the law of the land in my mind is the law of the land, and it must apply across the board. So in this context, I have circulated an amendment. Now, I understand, I know fully well this is a money bill. In a money bill, I have no vote, but there is nothing preventing me attempting to influence policy. That's the reason for this debate. As I did during Senator Sturge's motion on crime, I am attempting to influence policy to see to what extent, from where I sit, I could bring to bear to the debate my own positions on matters which could improve public policy. So that I have some concerns with respect to what exists in the clause 2 of this bill and what exists in the Pensions Act of Trinidad and Tobago 2352. And therefore, I am proposing the following for consideration. So this is the amendment I am proposing. Subclauses 7A and 7B shall apply to fire officers in the 1st Division and the 2nd Division who are eligible for the receipt of a pension and compulsorily retire, or who had compulsorily retired from the fire service prior to the proclamation date of this act. So that someone who retired in 2007, in my mind, should be covered based upon the provisions of the Pensions Act of Trinidad and Tobago, which to my mind is the law of the land. This will have to trump collective agreements. This Pensions Act states quite clearly that once you have acted for 3 years, you will get the pension. So I do not know whether the 2008 came in because of some collective agreement or not, but my position is I would like to conform with the law of the land. And therefore, Madam President, a fire officer who retired not in 2008, but in 1988, and who is still alive, should fall under the provisions of this particular bill. And Madam President, I raise this matter because of the following. It starts off with the first point I made. How much is it going to cost? I can assure this honorable chamber it is going to cost a very small amount. I have done some comparisons, Madam President. And I will throw out some figures, and I'm going somewhere. If I were to tell you there is a sum of $900,000 a month, what could we buy with that? I will tell you, if the PTSC wishes to get an articulated bus, we will be able to buy one of those buses with $900,000. But from a pure economics angle, I could also tell you that if we were to offer to our retired judges a pension of $30,000 a month, at 30 retired judges, we will also be able to pay judges in this country a decent pension of $30,000 a month. So one articulated bus or pensions to 30 judges. That matter is outstanding. It's a pensions matter. There is another issue. Pensions again. If I were to tell you, what could you do with $66,000 a month? You can't get a foreign use TIDA, Senator Sturge. You will get a used foreign used. A TIDA, which is from, and you see in economics it's called real analysis. What are the options before us? $66,000 will not get a foreign use TIDA. That you have to put out $100,000 for that. But a used foreign use you may be able to get for $66,000. What could we get for $66,000? Well, if there is any organization in Trinidad and Tobago, in which 22 persons are given a pension of $3,000 a month, somewhere in 2022. Those 22 persons, I'm not talking about the Senate, 22 persons at $3,000 a month, if they participate in a plan, will cost the state $66,000. The question, a month, $66,000 or $900,000 a month for judges. So the issue is not cost. The issue is not cost. The issue is priority. And let us look at the priority with respect to the fire services officers. The fire services officers are individuals who, to my mind, should come under the full protection of the law. And I'm looking at officers who have retired since 1988, not 2008. There couldn't be many of them who were acting, and therefore the cost to the state is going to be negligible. And recently, we had a public hearing on aging in this country, and it indicated that there are some 15% of the population now over 60 years in Trinidad and Tobago. And every year, that number is growing by 1%. But more than that, Madam President, more than that, what we are seeing is that the 80-plus population in Trinidad and Tobago is also growing. And I am sure there are many fire officers who retired prior to 2008 who would have acted. They may have retired in 1988. I am sure there are many fire officers out there who are perhaps in their 80s and who could benefit, because as you cross 80, it was revealed to us that there is a greater need for resources to help. So, Madam President, I would commend the Honorable Minister for looking at this. I hope that this particular group of officers is the only group in the country that is not now the beneficiary of the provision. But I also recommend looking at 16A of the Pensions Act. And if in fact 16A is since it is the law of the land, my suggested amendment to the government, this is a money bill, all I can do is suggest an amendment. One cannot challenge the need to regularize pensions. One cannot do that. One is looking forward. We have too many hodgepodge pieces of legislation in Trinidad and Tobago, and we need to make sure that the system becomes fairer and fairer. As our society ages, it is. And therefore, I would like the government to look at the Pensions Act, look at what is before us, and to determine whether now, legally, does it not make sense to ensure that all retired fire officers, not only those who retired since 2008 and who acted in their positions, but all officers who are still alive. They may have worked during the coup, during that difficult time, and they are still alive. They may be in their 80s, some may even be in their 90s. Could we look and see what provisions will be made and whether, in fact, the Pensions Act will not be the law that will rule, and that we will ensure that all fire officers, as in fact, Madam President, I would hope that all officers of the state, all public officers, not only in the fire service, but all public officers who were under the state's employ and who come under the protection of the laws of Trinidad and Tobago and who acted for 3 years continuously. I understand that we cannot make any major provisions for those who acted and had in short periods, may have acted for 10 years, but truncated positions. But for those who acted continuously, let us look and see whether in fact they are not entitled to having the same benefit as those who have retired since 2008. Madam President, I thank you.
Senator.
Madam President, I thank you for the opportunity to join in this debate on a bill entitled the Fire Services Amendment, an Act to amend the Fire Services Act, Chapter 3550 in this Honorable House. Madam President, this Act, which may also be cited as the Fire Services Amendment Act 2017, seeks to amend the 5th schedule to the Fire Services Act, Chapter 3550. by providing that a fire officer who has acted in a higher office for a continuous period of at least 3 years immediately prior to the date of his compulsory retirement, or on which he proceeds on annual leave before the date of his compulsory retirement, shall be eligible to have his pension, gratuity, and other allowances calculated as if he was substantively appointed to that higher office. Madam President, the bill provides that a fire officer who satisfies these requirements shall be required to pay in addition the contribution payable in a substantive office, arrears of contribution calculated on the basis of the pay he would have received in the higher office had he been substantively appointed. For example, if an officer's substantive rank is that of an assistant chief fire officer, but he's been acting continuously in the position of the rank of deputy chief fire officer at least 3 years prior to his retirement, his compulsory retirement, that officer could be afforded the opportunity to receive pension benefits in the position which he held as deputy chief fire officer upon satisfying the requirements. The bill further provides that arrears of contribution which is payable shall be determined on the basis of the pay the fire officer would have received in that higher office for each year in respect of what he acted continuously and deducted as 1, a lump sum from the gratuity payable to the fire officer where practicable, or 2, from the fire officer's pension in equal monthly installments over a period to be determined by the Comptroller of Accounts. The bill seeks to make these provisions applicable to fire officers in the 1st Division and the 2nd Division who reached their compulsory retirement age or who had compulsory retired from the fire service on or after the 1st of January 2008. Madam President, in actual fact, the bill seeks to give effect to a memorandum of agreement between the Chief Personnel Officer and the Fire Service Association of Trinidad and Tobago, 2nd Division, dated the March 6, 2012, for the period that covers January 1st, 2008 to December 31st, 2010. This agreement was ratified by Cabinet by minute number 643 on March 22nd, 2012, under the previous administration. On that day, in March 2012, Cabinet agreed that the Attorney General should amend the 5th schedule to the Fire Service Act to give effect to the terms of the agreement between the CPO and the Fire Service Association relating to pension arrangements. The agreement between the CPO and the Fire Service Association also addressed other areas such as salary, allowances, overtime, pension, etc. This bill follows other similar legislation that has been enacted since 2008 to give effect to the agreements between the CPO and the PSA, the CPO and tutor, and so on, to allow public officers to have a superannuation of benefits of the higher position upon retirement. Similar legislation and the effective dates of implementation are as follows. Can I read? Okay. In January 2004, the Pensions Act was amended to give similar effect to similar terms. On January 1st, 2005, Regulation 183A of the Police Service Regulations was amended. On January 1st, 2005, the Assisted Secondary School Teachers Pensions Act was amended to give effect to similar provisions. The Teachers Pension Act, Chapter 3902, was amended to give effect to similar provisions. On January 1st, 2007, the Prison Service Act was amended to give effect to similar provisions. And finally, in January 2004, the Municipal Corporations Pensions Act was amended to give effect to similar provisions. Madam President, in effect, what we are doing here is rectifying an anomaly by allowing a fire officer who has acted in a higher position for a continuous period of at least 3 years prior to retirement to receive the benefits of the higher office. Madam President, permit me some time on the importance of this piece of legislation. As I previously indicated, a wide range of public officers of Trinidad and Tobago would have already received the kind of benefit which this bill seeks to bestow on 2 fire officers. Madam President, we must remember that the pension benefits of retired officers really represent their sole income in their retirement life. It is therefore critically important, and in keeping with the dignity of the men and women of Trinidad and Tobago Fire Service, that we put this untenable matter to rest. Madam President, the matter threatens the very livelihood of these servicemen and women, as it potentially erodes their financial stability and security, if not implications for their continued existence. Furthermore, it is the right thing to do. The pension benefits of fire officers who would have worked hard for over the 3 years prior to their retirement should really reflect their acting salaries. Equity also demands that this should be so, since their peers in other services are afforded similar treatment. Madam President, I am advised that the Honorable Minister of Finance moved expeditiously to address this matter when he was made aware of the same, and for this we must commend him. Madam President, for me, on a personal level, I feel a sense of closeness to the subject matter, given that my husband, himself a member of the Protective Services, really provides an opportunity for reflection, context, and understanding. A lot of times, when we as citizens express frustration in the lack of delivery by various arms of the Protective Services, we do so with a broad brush castigating all police, fire, regiment, and Coast Guard as the same. The truth, Madam President, is that this is simply not true. The greater majority of men and women in uniform are our champions, and most importantly, our loved ones, committed to the greater good. These brave men and women put their lives on the line on a daily basis to protect us. I know this for a fact because my husband is one of the most hardworking, dedicated, committed servicemen of this country with the highest level of integrity and love for humanity. Before I conclude, Madam President, I would really like to put things into perspective. The Ministry of Public Administration and Communications has embarked on a new system with the intention to ensure timely delivery of pensions to public officers. Based on the recommendations from the PMCD, Public Management Consultant Division, the Ministry of Public Administration and Communications will use predominantly contract officers in staffing and pensions departments, giving them between 1 to 3 year contracts to ensure that we have a cadre of dedicated officers who will not be transferred or promoted, leaving a backlog of pensions. In addition, training will be offered both in-house and by the Treasury Division in the preparation and maintenance of pension and leave records. This training will be aimed at reducing the frequency of errors being made, which in many cases delay pension payments. Madam President, effective pension provision is important to this government. As a consequence, we have introduced programs across various ministries to train the trainers regarding the conduct of proper pension leave and records management, which is crucial, which is a crucial part of effective pension administration. Madam President, I am also advised that in furtherance of this objective of effective pension administration in various ministries, this government has implemented the drafting of desktop manuals, setting out procedures regarding pension and leave records management. This would ensure that there will be proper documented standard operating procedures which can be utilized by any new staff member on the pension and leave schedule of any ministry. The ministry also plans to develop the IHRIS, the Integrated Human Resource Information System, that is geared towards making pension and leave records easily accessible to the Comptroller of Accounts. This bill, in essence, will allow the fire service to be in line with prisons, teachers, police, and all other public officers in the wider public service. Finally, Madam President, I must say that I am delighted to be part of this caring and conscientious PNM government that seeks the interests of our men and women in uniform wherever they are, wherever they serve. Madam President, I thank you.
Senator Samuel.
Madam President, I always cherish the opportunity to speak in this House. I truly thank Almighty God for the privilege given to me to do so. And to speak once again on this bill, an act to amend the Fire Services Act, Chapter 3550. There has been much said and boastings about who has brought bills and how effective it has been, and what must prevail and what must die. But Madam President, I think that we are here today wasting our time.
Why is that?
Wasting our time because the government has brought a bill to amend the Fire Services Act that talks about the fire officer who has acted in a higher office for a continuous period of at least 3 years immediately prior to the date. And if we were thinking about amending and adjusting and doing things, I would have thought that we would have examined the Pension Act. And in examining the Pension Act, that we would have done any kind of amendment to deal with this particular situation. Because there is no clarity in this bill to talk about what it means clearly as immediately prior to the date. That can be interpreted. Madam President, if for some reason a person acts for 6 years in a position, and just prior to going on pre-retirement leave, he resorts to his substantial position because that position is filled, what happens to him?
Lost everything.
He has lost everything. Because there is nothing in the Act that deals with such situation if that person, just a month before going on pre-retirement leave, resumes his substantive position after acting for 6 years. There is nothing for him. And I would have thought that we would have brought a bill to deal with such situation, and it would have amended the Pensions Act and not bring a bill just to amend the Fire Services Act. But Madam President, I found it strange that in the Pensions Act, a public officer is clearly defined, which includes fire officers. And, Madam President,
read it.
I want to, if you're permitting me to read it, ma'am, that a public officer, and I want to read it clearly.
Interpretation section.
In the interpretation section, Madam President, it's very clear that an officer or public officer means a person substantially appointed to an office in the public service. It's very clear. So really, it covers every individual. Madam President, in the same Pensions Act, we have a similar situation clearly defined. It's clearly defined for all of us, Madam President, because it covers all and sundry, and it talks about police officers with regard to retirement, as well as fire officers in regards to retirement. And all of that is in the Pensions Act. So really, when we think about what is taking place here, we have been called to a sitting to debate nothing, because it is already in existence. The circumstances contemplated by this section, this is the Pensions Act, are that the officer has retired from the police service as a police officer, or a fire officer on attaining the age of 55. This is all included. And when it comes to 16A of the Pensions Act, Madam President, it says, where an officer who immediately, this seems to be the same thing, who immediately prior to the date of his compulsory retirement or the date on which he proceeds on annual leave prior to the date of compulsory retirement has acted in a higher office for a period of 3 continuous years, that officer shall be eligible to have his pension, gratuity, or other allowance calculated as if he was confirmed in that higher office, and for the purpose of computing such pensions and gratuity or others. This is the Pensions Act. As a matter of fact, Madam President, the computation of the pension in acting capacity prior to compulsory retirement 20 of 2008. Madam President, so we have been called here, and there was a lot of boasting about who bring it and who's all kinds of stuff. And really, this is a non-issue.
Zero.
We have wasted the time of the Senate to debate something that we thought was new, that was so appealing and defending and proud. And Madam President, if we had only read the Pensions Act, we would not be debating this. Madam President, and with all of the stuff that we go through today, and I know that my colleague would have wanted to talk about his experience in fighting for the fire officers and auxiliary fire officers, and he's right to talk about in defense of the fire officers. But Madam President, as we sit here today and as we sit in this house today, really there is nothing to debate again. There is absolutely nothing to debate again. As a matter of fact, the government should take this bill and withdraw it. They should withdraw this bill because they did not study the Pensions Act. Madam President, to continue this debate does not make sense. Does not make sense, Madam President. Why? Why? Madam President, because what is written here, and Madam President, we have to be careful that the benefits that are attached to the Pensions Act afforded to the retired officers in this particular thing can be overridden by this act. So we have got to be clear that what we are presenting now and want to approve does not cause a problem to those people who are covered by the Pensions Act. Implied, and it's called, my learned colleagues talk, because I'm no lawyer, it's talk about implied repeal. And I have good ones here. So I am very concerned that in not carefully examining this, that this could affect the benefits that are included in the Pensions Act to officers. So, Madam President, that is not basket, sir. Be careful. Be careful. This basket don't leak, you know.
Good basket don't leak.
This basket doesn't leak.
There's a basket of incompetence.
Madam President, Senator Wade Mark has alluded to the issue that should be dealt with in many instances. I have found out through research that there are some 300 vacant positions in the fire services. That has about 300 I found out. Yeah. That has not been absolutely fulfilled and satisfied. But that is a managerial problem. That is a public service situation. That is a public administration's problem. But we are here today to clearly deal with this particular bill. And this particular bill and the criteria is laid out here because, Madam President, the act covers both aspects of persons. It covers the person who acts, and it covers the person who is promoted. In 16b, it talks about where an officer who is promoted to a higher office has acted in that higher office, retires compulsorily, and the period of acting together with his service in the office to which he has been promoted amounts to the period of not less than 3 years, and it goes on, so it covers both the person who has just acted and the person who has acted and was promoted. So, Madam President, I'm not too sure where we're going from here. Unfortunately, I'm not too sure where we're going from here. But we need to go back to the Pensions Act and clarify if this bill does not affect the benefits laid out in the Pensions Act, and if it will not alter situations for those that have retired. Madam President, I would love the Minister of Labour to clear that up for me to ensure that it does not affect those who have been covered by the Pension Act, and if this really it is a necessary act. I thank you.
Thank you, Madam President, for the opportunity.
Singh.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President, for this opportunity to contribute in this very short debate. A money bill entitled An Act to Amend the Fire Services Act, Chapter 3550, consisting of 2 clauses, Madam President. 1 dealing with the short title, and 2, the clause that seeks to amend the 5th schedule, Chapter 3550. Madam President, before I continue, I just want to take this opportunity to respond to some of the comments made by my colleague from the other side. And Madam President, I've sat down here and listened attentively to the short contributions from all members so far. And I was almost in shock to hear the contribution from Senator Mark earlier today. And I'll explain why. In his contributions, Madam President, he indicated that he felt firefighters and officers were treated third class, bastardized, illegitimates, and so on. Madam President, I want to find out whether this feeling is short term, or in fact, how he felt during the period 2010 to 2015. Maybe perhaps all these feelings were invisible, or maybe the chair clouded his memory. Because, Madam President, the population of this country has not forgotten what has happened in this country, what has happened during the tenure of the last administration. And while I don't want to go and delve into any of the details per se, but we are speaking about compensation, pension, remuneration, and arrangements for firefighters and fire officers. And Senator Mark, in looking at the fire station headquarters in Port of Spain, reiterated the fact that he noticed there was a lack of equipment. The building was dilapidated. It was a shameful manifestation of what a fire station should be. Madam President, I'm an expert in construction. I'm an expert in sweet potatoes. But I want to say, a building, Madam President, a building cannot get in that stage overnight.
That's right.
It cannot be dilapidated to your eye, Senator Mark, overnight. It cannot be a shameful manifestation of what a fire station should look like. Because in my estimation, a measly fee, in their eyes, of $6.8 million to rescue a battered fire truck could have assisted.
That's right. Yeah.
The population will never forget that. Madam President, he spoke about the facilities, the fire station, and what it should look like. And after spending over $80 million on a fire station in Mayaro, with absolutely nothing in it, that is what a fire station should look like.
As you already signed for. Why?
Madam President,
You want to talk about 92,000?
I remember looking on August the 29th, 2015, 1 week before the general election. Big opening. Rio Claro, the Mayaro fire station was opened.
Senator Sturge, you're addressing me?
Just mumbling. Point of order, 46. Yeah, just mumbling.
No, Senator Singh, continue.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, Senator Mark spoke to not only offering pension and remuneration and resources to effectively deal with the responsibility by fire officers and firemen. He spoke to making the buildings and all these things modern. And I'm saying, a week before election, you open a building, Madam President, with absolutely nothing in it to deal with a fire. 1 week before election, after over $80 million, and that is what the population will never forget. So, Madam President, why we are here? Madam President, the role of a fire service in our situation is laid out in the laws of our country, Chapter 3550, Clause 3A, and it speaks to the purpose of the Trinidad and Tobago Fire Service. A, to save and protect life or property from damage or destruction by fire and other hazards, whether fire-related or not. B, to provide and advise upon preventative measures against the occurrence of such damage or destruction. C, to render related humanitarian services which require. And D, to conduct investigations in order to ascertain the cause of origins of a fire and other hazard requiring the service of the fire service. Madam President, our firemen and our fire officers are very important stakeholders in our country. And I say this on the backdrop of an example recent in my mind, and I'll share that example shortly. But Madam President, up to this morning on my way to Port of Spain, I saw 2 fire tenders on the highway putting off a blaze on the highway that was severely obstructing the view of the traveling population. And in our country, Madam President, we have 2 seasons, the dry and the wet. For those who don't know, the dry season is January to May, wet June to December. And during that time, Madam President, January to May, the fire service is called upon to execute their duties almost every day to treat with fires. These fire officers, firemen, firewomen put their lives out every day during the crop season and sometimes in the rainy season, Madam President. And we are here today to offer and to compensate some of these officers. And the Honorable Minister of Labour, in laying this piece of legislation, gave us some information and some insights, and I know she will provide some more detail as to how many persons probably would stand to benefit and so on. But as I said, the fact of the matter is that our stakeholders, Madam President, are very important. And in dealing with fires, forest fires, I'm sure over billions of dollars in assets and financial assets, goods, and so on are saved each year from the hard work of our fire officers and fire officials. And Madam President, in the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries, we also have departments that deal with fire or assist the fire officers in dealing with fire. And I stand here in remembrance of one soul, heroic and brave, that assisted the fire officials in dealing with a forest fire in the Chancellor Hill. Madam President, one, the late Keith Campbell, who risked his life. And Madam President, on that morning of that fire, would you imagine that this gentleman got a call on that morning only to tell him that his mother passed away and did not even leave his job to go to tend to funeral arrangements and so on, went out there into the fire and was treating with this fire, assisting the fire officials. Mind you, he was a senior forester attached with the Forestry Division of the Ministry of Agriculture. And Madam President, at age 50, we lost a brave soldier to fire. So it's no ordinary job, Madam President, in dealing with fires. And Madam President, if at a payback we treat with the remuneration, the pension arrangements for persons who would have served in different capacities, 3 years and over, it's not too much to ask for. But Madam President, more than that, I listened to Senator Samuel's contribution and I'm shocked again. Because he said we are wasting our time with this bill. We have been called to sit in to debate nothing. Then why are you here?
That's right. Why did he speak?
He said to withdraw the bill, Madam President. Why did you even bother to stand?
Irrelevant.
To waste our time, yes. Madam President. Madam President, Senator Samuel should have withdrawn himself from cabinet meeting on the 22nd of March 2012. Or maybe he was not in cabinet at that point in time. When the UNC cabinet approved minute number 643, confirming the agreement between the UNC government and the Fire Service Association to come here and totally remove yourself from this bill, Madam President, is contrary to the truth. Madam President, this bill before us seeks to give effect to a collective agreement negotiated by the UNC, signed by them on the 6th of March 2012. It is to give effect a collective agreement between the government, the fire service. Madam President, it was conceptualized by the UNC. We are here because we care about these fire officials and fire officers. Because, Madam President, when oil was over $100 a barrel in 2012, 2013, 2014, the UNC did absolutely nothing for these firemen and these fire officers. Absolutely nothing. But we are here in the current economic circumstances.
Remind them.
Madam President, we are here to serve the people of this nation with excellence. And Madam President, you see, people tend to forget, but we don't forget. Madam President, today, as I said, I'm happy to be a part of this bill where a lot of hard-working officers stand to benefit. And the clauses are set out, Madam President. Clause 7A is for persons to, who has acted in a higher office, as I said earlier. And then B, to satisfy the requirement, Madam President, they are made to pay the arrears or the addition. And I think it's only fair. If an officer is going to benefit from a new addition, then they are asked to pay whatever relevant differences in arrears. So, Madam President, I had to clear the record. Of course, I had to clear Senator Samuel and Senator Mark's commentary this morning, earlier, and to place on the record that the people of this country will never forget what you did with respect to the fire stations, the fire issues, and even the fire officers who would have stand to benefit from their pension and remuneration packages had you or had your Attorney General had gone to Parliament to pass the same bill. So, Madam President, I'm happy to support this bill here today and to say to the people of this country that the PNM, we are here and we are doing everything in our power to make sure that every citizen benefit from our actions, Madam President. I thank you.
Senator Ameen.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I want to thank you for this opportunity to contribute to this debate on the Fire Services Amendment Bill 2017. Madam President, as an individual, my contribution here has a personal element because a number of my very close relatives are members of the protective services and the fire services in particular. And I personally know what members of the families of our officers who serve in the fire service of the Trinidad and Tobago Fire Service, the emotional aspect of having a relative risk their lives to save the lives of other citizens. And so it is with a personal appreciation that I hope to be able to share today, Madam President, a bit on the role of the fire service, on some of the rights that being a fire officer, as a fire officer, you lose the right to do certain things. I also want to talk about the role of ethics and morality and public trust in the fire services. Before I go into matters concerning the terms and conditions of these brave men and women in the Trinidad and Tobago Fire Services who protect our lives every day. Madam President, the role of the fire service has really expanded over the years. In addition to fires, our firefighters also mobilize to manage disasters, to threaten life and properties. I have had the pleasure of working with our fire officers as the chairman of Tunapuna Piako Corporation in a time of disaster. They are trained to do our rescue operations involving road accidents. Very often, they are first on the scene cutting damaged cars to take out persons to save their lives. They are involved when there are flood and swift water evacuation, hazardous materials and chemicals, urban search and rescue, and rescues during and after natural disasters. All of this, of course, is in addition to their key component role in community education and awareness on fire safety. And which kindergartner doesn't look forward to visiting the nearby fire station? And of course, Madam President, in recent years, the role of firefighters internationally has been enhanced to include emergency paramedical services, something that I think will be more and more incorporated into our own fire services, although they do provide an element of that. Madam President, I want to share on a paper written by Ernest R. Archer, and it's called Things You Lose the Right to Do When You Become as a Fire Officer. Things you lose the rights to do as a fire officer. Madam President, our men and women who serve in the Trinidad and Tobago Fire Services are human beings first. And as humans, we are prone to our own idiosyncrasies, our own emotional ways of treating with things. But let us remember that the men and women who are in the fire services, they lose their right to lose their temper. Madam President, while we in other professions may have a propensity to become easily angry or irritable, firefighters who are functioning at emergency scenes and who often deal with very emotional relatives, let's say, of injured persons or missing persons, for example. And these persons should not have to deal with the additional anxiety of a quick-tempered fire officer. You lose the right to be one of the gang. Being an effective fire officer is not about making friends or directing your friends who are part of your team, your rescue team, to do things because of your friendship with them. When they are your subordinates, they are directed to complete tasks and complete assignments, of course, in a friendly environment. And I often hear members of the fire services saying that they are not friends, they are family. Striving to be one of the gang, instead of serving in a leadership role, may create an intimidating workplace for some officers and result in career-endangering incidents. Madam President, fire officers must never engage or tolerate unlawful or unethical conduct from any of their subordinates on watch. And I want to take this opportunity to implore particularly those in supervisory position in our fire service at this time to ensure that under their watch they do not allow unlawful and unethical conduct in the service. One of the things as a fire officer you also lose the right to do is to share your personal problems with your co-workers. Because when you do that in an environment where you are expected to lead and give instructions, eventually firefighters who are junior to you will question your own professional fitness to command if you are an officer who can't manage your personal life. You know, very often co-workers may share their own personal issues involving finances or relationships or children or, you know, just how the traffic was this morning. But that is a right that fire officers lose. They lose the right to express professional frustrations and personal opinions with their subordinates. And while, of course, in every service, I could imagine, people gripe about salaries, about benefits, about politicians, about their station, about their work assignments. Overall, they can't make a habit of taking any controversial positions, especially on social issues and political issues. Because it diminishes their own influence and the respect that the public would have for them. Firefighters, Madam President, also lose the right to advocate the status quo. When firefighters consider the tremendous changes that have occurred and are now occurring, officers must develop a preference for always questioning the status quo and to be advocates for better, faster, safer, simpler approaches for delivering quality emergency services. That change officers must resist the change officers must resist the urge to be comfortable or complacent with their regular habits. And very often people are under the perception that fire officers, they spend their day in their station because there are hardly any fires. They spend their day just checking equipment. They might eat breakfast, make a cook in the station, relax, eat lunch, come back and make another cook. And they might have one or two interruptions with the alarm, but the fact is that that is not the life of a fire officer. Senior fire officers also lose the right to delegate unpopular tasks to their subordinates, because as they go up in rank, of course, they will have to delegate more tasks. But the fact is that when you operate as a team, you often share by round robin those tasks, those dislikable tasks, and that often earns the fire officers respect as they grow in stature. Fire officers who are senior in the service also lose the right to ask others to do what they would not do. And it comes again similarly from working as a team. Madam President, I just want to share that so that we will not take for granted that the fire services, that the Trinidad and Tobago Fire Service is one where our men and women spend their days idly. But, Madam President, of course, with this also comes the responsibility to maintain public trust. Our citizens who are served often hold members of the fire service in high esteem. In fact, for many decades in Trinidad and Tobago, it is a very respectable thing to have a son or daughter in the family who is a part of the Trinidad and Tobago Fire Service, and that remains a very admirable and respected position. And for this purpose, the officers, of course, have an additional responsibility to maintain public trust in them by maintaining their professional ethics and moralities and their own values. Madam President, I just want to quote Mark Twain, who said, "It is curious that physical courage should be so common in the world and moral courage so rare." Our fire service demonstrates physical courage on a daily basis. However, Madam President, it is important for them to also cultivate the moral courage that is necessary to lead and to protect our citizens and to ensure that all of their members are acting within the service's best moral and ethical interests. Madam President, I use that as my opening because I want to underscore how important it is for us to treat with the terms and the conditions under which our officers operate. Madam President, while we are here to discuss the amendment proposed in the 5th schedule of the Fire Service Act, Chapter 3550, which provides for the payment of pensions and gratuities to the fire officers of the 1st and 2nd Division, we are currently at a time where, very recently on the 31st of January this year, the Minister of Finance, in giving a feature address at the formal opening of the new corporate headquarters of the National Insurance Board, in his speech, made a revelation that is of concern to all who in Trinidad and Tobago who will at some point receive a pension. And I quote, financial projections in 2013 reveal national insurance funds would be completely depleted by 2030 if contributions are not increased. As such, in order to protect and preserve the national insurance system, the actuaries recommended that the government examine the possibility of an increase in the retirement age from the age of 60 to 65 over the period 2025 to 2060. Our generation would have less challenges when it comes to health. We have more awareness of health and taking care of ourselves. We are living longer, and so the issue of pensions in general is very critical. I know that the minister indicated that no decision has been taken with regards to changing the pension age based on the National Insurance Fund situation to pay or to not pay beneficiaries. But it certainly is something that we must ponder. And so when we have a situation where at present, very often our retiring officers wait for years. My colleague, Senator Mark, indicated that sometimes for 2 years, officers wait for pension. And this is not only in the fire service. It happens in the public service as well. And I recall that a couple months ago, the Prime Minister, Honorable Dr. Keith Rowley, was making a pronouncement, a public statement about monies that he felt the Parliament owed him. And he said to the nation, I don't like my money to sleep out. And I am asking, if as the leader of this nation, if as the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, you don't like your money to sleep out, what steps are you taking to fix it for the thousands of public servants, for the thousands of people in the protective services and other parts of public service who wait for more than 2 years to get their pensions and gratuity? Our Prime Minister ought to lead by example when it comes to matters like these. But then again, we have a very long list of disappointments when it comes to Honorable Keith Rowley. Madam President, I want to go into the need for us to treat with the situation mentioned by another speaker before me with regards to auxiliary fire officers. And while the other speaker would have gone in depth into the recruitment process and what happens to these auxiliary officers, I fully agree because they undergo similar training, they put their lives at risk, and very often they are bypassed when it comes to the benefits of the job that they do, and some of them spend years trying to get into the mainstream service without success. And it's very similar to the situation with SRPs, Special Reserve Police Officers. And we have a situation now, Madam President, where many of them are working full-time in different parts of the police service, in stations, in the court, and several places, putting their lives at risk. But they cannot get the same benefits, the same terms and conditions as those in the mainstream service. And this applies both for the SRPs and the auxiliary fire officers. And so I want to take this opportunity to call on the Minister of National Security to ensure that the terms and conditions for the auxiliary fire officers and the special reserve officers are regulated by meeting with them and the respective union and representative bodies. Madam President, when the People's Partnership was in government, a policy decision was taken to have $1 million compensation for police officers who lost their lives in the line of duty. While we have seen a lack of political will from the present government to implement this, you even had the leader of opposition drafting the cabinet note and sending it to the government without success. there is need, Madam President, for us to move from that policy decision that was taken by the People's Partnership for the continuity of having that legislation come to Parliament and approved, and then, of course, implementing it, and extending that to fire officers who lose their life in the line of duty. So today I want to call on the government, one, to implement or to take the necessary steps to make good on the promise to have the $1 million compensation for police officers who lose their lives in the line of duty, and to examine having a similar compensation available for the families of our fire officers who lose their lives in the line of duty. Madam President, the terms and conditions of our fire officers, I really don't want to, it's important for me to stress that. While speakers on both sides, on 3 benches, would have mentioned the terms, the conditions, the facilities, and so on, we must remember that while fire officers do have a representative union, they don't have the right to protest action as some other services, the public service, and so on. So it is important for those in authority, regardless of which political party they belong to ensure that their terms and conditions are satisfactory. And when it comes to their facilities, there are a number of fire stations that were renovated by the People's Partnership government. In fact, the speaker before me mentioned the Mayaro fire station, a brand new station that was completed during the term of the People's Partnership government. You also had the fire station in Arima and so on, getting a bigger facility. And Madam President, the thing is that while in everything there's a process. So I am happy that, unlike what is happening with the Couva Children's Hospital, that the Mayaro Fire Station was opened and is operational, thanks to the People's Partnership government. So while the person who has not accepted the defeat at the polls in Mayaro continues to boast about Mayaro Police Station, it was built by the People's Partnership government. We must also, Madam President, look at the resources and the training. I want to bring a matter to the attention of the Parliament, and I trust that the Minister of National Security could look into that matter. The facilities in which fire officers have their training, for many years, they would have moved them from one building to another. A number of very old buildings were used. And I remember there was a year when several recruits, about 30 recruits, had to be taken to the Port of Spain General Hospital in a bus, a fire services bus, because the ambulance simply could not transport them one at a time, because they were in a building that was affected by what you call old building syndrome, where mold and so on was in the building and it was affecting them. They also had no water. There was one very rusty water tank, and because of the lack of water and being in that building, many of them developed lung infections, and it really took a toll on them and their training. But of course, their rigorous training had to be completed, and the senior officers would have dealt with the families of these new recruits to ensure that they got the right medical care. But the fact is that this stemmed from insufficient facilities. A number of improvements were made during the People's Partnership term in office. I know that they have changed facility, but I'm saying there's a need to continue strengthening the training facilities and the training resources of our Trinidad and Tobago fire services. Madam President, those are considerations to be taken when you speak about decent work and decent work conditions. The Minister mentioned Trinidad and Tobago's commitment to the decent work agenda. Our nation is a member of the International Labour Organization, and the ILO strongly holds to its decent work agenda. The United Nations Economic and Social Council has given a general comment that defines decent work and requires and decent work calls for the integration of economic and social objectives and for well-orchestrated combination of measures in the areas of employment promotion, rights at work, social protection, and social dialogue. This approach is proving its relevance to a wide-ranging policy agenda and social dimensions of globalization to poverty reduction strategies. And in different countries, there are different points on which their nations reflect on their priorities with regards to decent work. For some of them, it deals more with poverty alleviation, some more with the terms and conditions and child labor and so on. But we must remember that the ILO decent work agenda really is a balanced and integrated programmatic approach to pursue the objectives of full and productive employment and decent work for all at global, regional, national, and sectorial as well as local levels. And when we examine the terms and conditions, particularly of those who serve in areas where they can't protest, we must ensure that they are provided with what is necessary. So while our minister gives her commitment, I want to ask her to make good on her word by ensuring that those officers are treated as fairly as they should as workers. Madam President, the minister in her opening also indicated that the government is committed to treating workers fairly. Madam President, I found that interesting. I recall that in the term of office 2010 to 2015, there were over 70 negotiations that were settled, wage negotiations that were settled by the People's Partnership Government. I understand also that the last negotiations for the fire service, Trinidad and Tobago Fire Service, would have been in 2015, and that was for the period 2011 to 2013. There was a three-year agreement that ended in 2016. So the period 2016, 2017, and so on has to be negotiated. And I want to call on the government to begin the negotiation with the relevant authorities for the terms and conditions and the wages of the members of the Trinidad and Tobago Fire Service urgently. The government does not have to wait until the end of the period to begin the negotiations. Madam President, also on that note, the minister had indicated that that the government is moving towards ending contract labor, which is a good thing. However, I have seen a number of ads, a number of new employment being advertised for contract workers in state agencies and in government ministries. So although the minister has indicated that by giving her word here, the fact is that the government continues to advertise and to hire contract workers. I know that we have a situation where I understand there are more than 10,000 vacancies. There is a need to train and retrain people in our civil service as well as our protective service, and particularly in the fire service. But I want to, perhaps the minister may address that issue in her wrapping up. The fact that ministries, government ministries and agencies are still advertising for contract positions. I know you have given I know the minister has given a commitment that the government is moving in the direction of ending contract labor. And I know it's a process, I know it will take some phasing out, but perhaps if you could give us an idea of how long that process will take. Madam President, in today's debate, I also wanted to put on record, on behalf of the United National Congress, the appreciation that we have for the work of the dedicated officers of the Trinidad and Tobago Fire Service. I want to note as well that as officers continue to retire, the value of their pension and gratuity based on the approval of the amendment we have before us today, it really is fast disappearing in the current economic environment. The purchasing power of our retirees' pension is fast depreciating. Madam President, there was a study in 2014 that indicated 40% of those at retirement age did not receive a pension which was adequate. And we must be mindful as we continue, and I say we in this Parliament, but the government must be mindful that with an increasing aging population and so many of our citizens dependent on their pensions, the economic policies of the government really is not in the interest of our citizens, and their actions continue to depreciate the value of the pensions of those who have worked hard and served this country because of the constant increase in food prices and essential items. Madam President, I also see this bill as bringing a sense of comfort to our fire officers. I must mention that there are a number of acting appointments within the fire services that should be dealt with to ensure further comfort to our fire officers, and that they are in fact dealt with in a fair manner when it comes to their pension. I'm not sure if another member in their debate mentioned the Public Service Regulation, Section 43(1), Part 5, when it comes to payment of pension. And it says that the Chief Fire Officer, via the Permanent Secretary, shall ensure that the particulars of service and the pay for each officer whose retirement is known to be imminent are furnished accurately to the Comptroller of Accounts no less than 6 calendar months before the date each concerned is to retire. And I want to endorse the point that was made earlier, that it is very important for the process that is required, of course, for accountability purposes to be followed, but for it to be done in a speedy manner to ensure that you don't have the members of the Trinidad and Tobago Fire Service who have pension and gratuities outstanding, that their monies will not be sleeping out. Madam President, I want to thank you for this opportunity, and particularly because, as I said earlier, I have a great appreciation, personal appreciation, for the men and women who serve in the Trinidad and Tobago Fire Services and who put their lives on the line every day. I thank you very much.
Honourable Senators, I think I can sense that everyone is ready for us to suspend. So we will do that at this stage. So we suspend and we will return at 6 p.m.